to tonight's Oprah's distinguished speaker, David Brooks. Mr. Brooks' column on the op-ed page of the New York Times started in September 2003. He has been a senior editor of the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and the Atlantic Monthly, and he is currently a commentator on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. He is the author of Bobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How They Got There, and On Paradise Drive, How We Live Now and Always Have in the Future Tense. Mr. Brooks joined the Weekly Standard at its inception in September 1995, having worked at the Wall Street Journal for the previous 9 years. His last post at the Journal was as op-ed editor. Prior to that, he was posted in Brussels, covering Russia, the Middle East, South Africa, and European affairs. Mr. Brooks is a graduate of the University of Chicago, and he worked as a police reporter for the City News Bureau, a wire service owned jointly by the Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Brooks.
It's like being chief rabbi of Mecca. There's a lot of company there. No, I enjoy it. It's a great paper. And for those of you over 30, I hope you subscribe. And for those of you under 30, a newspaper is a piece of paper with words on it. It's a pleasure to be here in Minnesota. I've been preparing for this night for about 25 years since I married my wife, who was from here. Her father was a guy named Tom Hughes, who was a college roommates with Don Frazier and Walter Mondale. Her dad went to work in Washington to work for Orville Freeman as his chief of staff of the Ag Department, and then she grew up in the Minnesota Mafia out there, which used to run Washington, which Al Franken may bring back. More Jewish mafia. By the way, I noticed Arlen Specter endorsed Norm Coleman today. That's not a lie. He actually did an interview with the Times, so his timing is impeccable. But my wife introduced me to Minnesota and its culture. Her family is originally from Detroit Lakes, which I'm sure you all know. And if you grew up in New York City like I did, and you hear of a town called Detroit Lakes, it sounds a little weird, like Newark Gardens. That makes sense. And I got to learn about walleye and Norwegian jokes and all the stuff that you have here in your fine culture. She went to work when we were first married for Senator Dave Ehrenberger, who might be here today. There he is, right in the front row. Senator Ehrenberger was actually at our wedding, so that was an early influence on my life. He convinced me that being a moderate Republican was really the wave of the future. And I've learned a lot about Minnesota. I've learned my coping strategy when dealing with women from Minnesota, which is capitulation. I've been for the past 25 years. I've also learned from my wife's family that since you're from Minnesota, you didn't actually come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourselves speak. So I will try to be brief, and a lot of you guys spoke to me. And I will talk about the age of Obama. And it is interesting to be in Washington these days. The zeitgeist shifts around, and I've tried to follow it as it shifts. In the 1990s, the zeitgeist really centered on Silicon Valley, the dot-com boom, and I wrote a lot of pieces about the people, the sorts of people who were working in the dot-com era. I wrote a book called Bobos in Paradise, which is about people with 60s values and 90s money. People who shopped at Ben & Jerry's ice cream, the ice cream company with its own foreign policy. I joked in that book that Ben & Jerry's should make a pacifist toothpaste. It doesn't kill germs, just ask them to leave. I said in Silicon Valley, it was socially acceptable to have a luxury car, so they all had Saabs and Audis and Volvos. A luxury car so long as it came from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. And then they shopped in those days at Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, sort of progressive grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. In that book, my favorite section of Whole Foods was the snack food section, which had couldn't have pretzels and potato chips because that would be vulgar, so they had these seaweed-based snacks, which we got in my house, was called veggie booty with kale. For kids to come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. But the zeitgeist has shifted away from Silicon Valley and has shifted to Washington. We now, in Washington, we run the economy. I met some of the business school students earlier today, as we call them, future government workers. We run the banks, we run the auto industry, we run the housing industry, energy, and we are just going great guns. Our economy has never been better, so thank you very much. I keep reading about a housing crisis, but literally when I drive to work, I pass about 10 or 15 McMansions going up in my suburb. So Washington has become, thanks to President Obama, thanks to the economic crisis, the center of the economy, and maybe the center of the world economy for a little while, and we're enjoying it. And I'm going to try to tell you today a little about our system and a little about, I think, where President Obama is headed. And the first thing you should know is that we are a system dominated by politicians. And I have covered politicians closely for about 25 years. The best advice I got when I became a columnist was to try to interview 3 politicians every day, which was actually advice Bob Novak gave me, and it was very good advice. And the first thing you learn when you do that is that almost all of them are emotional freaks of one sort or another. Some of them have a tremendous fear of being alone. They need to dominate every room they enter. Some of them have enormous heads. If you look around the U.S. Senate, as somebody said, what they have is not a head, it's more or less a container for a head. Some of them have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. Actually, the reverse case of that is Joe Biden, who talks so much he actually has driven himself sane. Tremendous perverse affection for Joe Biden. They will also invade your personal space. If you spend time with with politicians, they'll generally grab you by the shoulders. I sat next to a senator at the convention here in Minneapolis or St. Paul last summer, and he kept his hand on my inner thigh the whole time. I actually once saw Dan Quayle and Ted Kennedy meet on the well of the Senate, and I was up in the press balcony, which is sort of up above, and they were friends, and they hugged, and their faces were this far apart, and they kept hugging and talking and laughing and telling each other stories and rubbing their hands up and down each other's backs and sort of grinding there. And I was like, get a room, I don't want to see this. But they actually do care about the country. We in the press corps are too cynical about politicians, and voters, I find, are even more cynical than we are. There was a woman I covered a few years ago named Deborah Price, who was a moderate Republican congresswoman from Columbus, Ohio, and she was in one of these tight districts, and she ran tough races every 2 years. And when you do that, the consultants come in and take over your campaign and run some pretty nasty stuff. And she has really nasty stuff running against her, and she ran some nasty stuff against her opponent. And one day her 93-year-old mother calls her up and says, Deborah, I want you to know I'm ashamed of you.